evening and welcome to Inside the Rookery Season 9 Episode 10, which also happens to be our 150th episode. Welcome to the stream, Rev Casey of ThoughtPunks. We're really happy to have you and have you join us for a milestone episode 150. Tonight we are talking about open source gaming.
So hi, I'm Rev Casey. I am the person who runs ThoughtPunks. We make a whole bunch of different stuff, including the Motif system, which is our big flagship. Which actually isn't a game unto itself. It's a solo and like low prep GM assistant tool. You just roll some dice and they give you answers. It's a lot of fun. Right now, I've got a campaign going on for Hits the Fan, which is comedic heist game. If you like Blades in the Dark and you like Fiasco, this is the game for you. The role itself is almost more of an event generation engine. It's a chaos engine rather than necessarily task resolution. So I encourage you to go check that out. And I'm also currently fundraising for an e-bike. I have epilepsy and some other issues, and so driving isn't good for me, and public transit hasn't been great when I need to get home when I'm not feeling well. So any help would be appreciated for that. And so today I'm here to talk about open gaming with these fine folks, and I'm excited to be here for the 150th episode. That's awesome. To hit a milestone.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And we've definitely, like those games you mentioned, like Blades in the Dark and stuff, are big fan, like our community are big fans of those systems. So I think there will be a lot of a lot of interest and overlap generated today.
Awesome.
And Andy has shared the links in the chat on whatever platform you're watching this on, as we have our on-demand through YouTube. I've brought up the YouTube links on the screen. You'll find them in the comments. So we've answered the question, what are you working on right now? And now we're going to go to our pre-submitted questions from our Discord server and our lovely patron community. But as always, please do drop your comments and drop your thoughts into the chat, and I will bring them up on screen for Rev or one of the two Rooks to answer, depending on what your question is. So let's get to it. So Supernaut asks, in regards to open source gaming, is this trying to utilize open source software in the production of gaming materials, or open sourcing your entire game, or indeed another option you'd like to tell us about?
Well, the primary focus of it is open sourcing systems in games, especially like SRDs and like straight creative. A lot of games like Thirsty Sword Lesbians, all of the text, or Ars Magica, all of the text is Creative Commons licensed for use. And so that counts as an example of open source. And just real quick, what I mean by open source is that it's open to use for whether it's private or commercial purposes, and it's forever licensed to be open. I'm sure we'll touch on it later, but there's some licenses that are revocable, because unless you say they're irrevocable, the common law of the way contracts work is that you can revoke them. So. But yeah, it's mainly focused on that, but it also does include other aspects, like a lot of things that go into game materials. Like there are some open source tools, software tools out there for like creating character sheets and running games and things like that. If you ever get a chance to run into him, RP Deschal is a great designer. Breathless, Push SRD, and he has some great open source software tools. But another aspect of it is like open source art, Creative Commons and open licensed art is a big thing, especially for the production of indie games. Art can be a very big burden for producers. So using public domain and open licensed art is also part of the general open gaming vibe.
It's always good to get our definitions out there up front. So Mr. Mike Magnus says, just got 148 more episodes to watch. Yes, you do. And as I said, they're on YouTube. So get cracking.
Get to it.
Get to it. Yeah, we'll see you, I guess, in, I don't know, a few weeks. Oh, Supernaut's watching. Supernaut pre-submitted that and says, thank you, Rev. Appreciate the answers. No bother. That is why we are here, to get answers.
Absolutely.
Out of people. So Zoltan asks, how do you approach adapting an open source or licensed system to make it feel personal and unique without losing its core identity?
Well, I'll first of all be honest that when I hack things personally, I don't really worry about preserving their core identity. I'm going for whatever my hack is. But if you do have that concern, a good way to do it is to list out like 2 to 4 things that you think are key to what makes that core identity. So, if you're working with, whether it's the D&D SRD or the Forged in the Dark, which is the Blades in the Dark SRD, or anything like that, like listing out the 2 to 4 things that you think are what makes this to me. Because for some people, like with Blades in the Dark, for example, the downtime loop is the absolute big thing for them. Whereas for other people, how it handles stress and harm might be like a number 1 priority. So whatever it is for you, listing out those few things that you think make it what it is, and then just keeping that on the side so that as you're hacking, if something touches on those things, you can look and see, how do I make it fit into these things or within these boundaries, which you're doing in the first place using an SRD. You're accepting certain boundaries or a certain shape or direction to your design. So this is just a way to help, that's a good way to help focus that up, where you can make it feel personal doing whatever hacks you want. And then to make it feel personal, you can do the same thing. List out 2 to 4 key principles or themes or concepts that you really want to highlight in your game. And then having those short little lists together, you can kind of balance them out.
Yeah, I think that's a really good tip, and you just added it there at the end, what I was going to say, which is it doesn't just have to be like mechanically what made that original property. It can be theme, it can be tone, and constantly thinking, right, I'm writing, if you're writing a TTRPG, I'm writing a character, I'm writing a quotation for a character, I'm writing a career, like how do I make it more about betrayal? Like what speaks to, if that's your theme, what speaks to betrayal in this character, what speaks to betrayal in the way this character speaks, etc. And that's been a really good touch kind of writing tip that I've had over the years from when I've been getting them from an editor or from someone who's been commissioning those.
That was it. We talked about this on the stream before, but a couple of months ago, Kieran Gillen had on his Blue Sky had this sort of discussion thread about RPGs and about what's at the core of it. And he has come around to this position that the fundamental question is, what kind of story are you telling? And you need to be clear on that, and that everything else has to come after that. And he is not a fan of a universal system anymore, of something that tries to encompass every type of story you could possibly tell, because he feels that you lose focus, Ben. And I'm not entirely sure I agree. Maybe the proper universal system that everybody wants to play with is the Holy Grail or the windmill that we are tilting at, depending which method.
Well, I think he has a good point there.
Yeah.
I think he has a good point there. Like, for example, like the way systems feel can be really different. If you're, we're using D10s, right? So we can run a percentage system using D10s, and it's going to feel very harsh and very exacting. Those percentile rolls feel very, very harsh, especially when you hit like a 62 when you needed a 63.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Right? Like it's very exacting and very harsh, but that's great for a game like Call of Cthulhu, where you want that very exacting, very harsh kind of feeling. It makes the world feel more dangerous, everything feel more risky. But then you could do D10 dice pools like World of Darkness does, which has more granular and heroic more feel to it. You can do bigger things, and there's more of a scale of success to it. And so just talking about the raw dice system there, you can get 2 very different feels using the same type of dice. And so that can be a big consideration when you're writing games. But I also appreciate the idea of being concept first. I'm a very concept first designer. People who follow me on Blue Sky or Mastodon know that. I have games that are as bluntly titled as Dinosaur Wizards in Space and Dick Punch Every Suit. And they are exactly what they say on the label. And I love that kind of design personally, to both doing it and playing it, where there's a very, very clear concept and it's just what it says on the label plays like that.
And how did you come to that? Have you always, like, since you started creating or even playing, before you started creating, were you like completely focused on, I really like a clear concept and I like to know what
because I had sort of a non-traditional start to my tabletop gaming experience, because most people start with like D&D. That's the big elephant in the room. And in my generation, a lot of people started with Vampire and World of Darkness, which I did play. But I got started with games like Toon and James Bond and Ghostbusters and Ars Magica and Paranoia. So a lot of these games that were comparatively extremely concept driven, even down to the mechanics and the way they worked. Like some of those games I mentioned are like the godfathers of a lot of modern design things. Like James Bond had the story point type of thing going on way back in the early 80s. And so I had a very different start to gaming, and so I think that influenced a lot of how I see games and the kinds of games that I gravitate towards.
It's interesting. I'm exactly the same. I very little. I think I maybe played the red box like literally once for like one session, and I bounced quite hard off of it. And it was I think it was Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay first. But as I've kind of alluded to in the chat, the game that really kind of woke up, like in terms of like GM and storytelling and stuff, that was very thematic, was Conspiracy X. The kind of the
oh nice, I remember that one.
And it was, again, that was a system that is like so driven on that type of story, that X-Files zeitgeist. But there were aliens and there were supernatural and but everything in the system was designed around that, to the point of the psychic system relied on using like this kind of Xener cards, so that if you were actually psychic, you were better at playing a psychic, because you could.
Oh, nice! That's fun.
And it just, it's a bit of fun, but it kept everything so thematically kind of on point. So yeah.
Did you ever play with anyone who was actually psychic?
Well, no, unless they were deliberately playing badly in order to fool us.
to fool you, yeah.
Possible. I'm not going to rule it out.
Yeah. I've never been fussed about systems. I could take it or leave it with like, I'm all about story and character. But I do like my system to be efficient and well constructed. Like, like I say I'm not fussed about systems, but I fucking hate a bad one.
Yeah, and you like a themed minigame.
Oh, I love a themed minigame.
Yeah, like when
I don't like a system. It's just, I would say, like, I always came to role playing with characters and wanting to know what the story was, and the system, whatever the system was always a bit of a barrier for me, especially when you come, like, well, I first played like D&D when I was like 7, and that doesn't really count. Like, did anyone even read the rules? I don't think so. And then had a bit of a break, and then the game playing was like your playground telling stories where you pretend to be like Princess Leia and Luke Skywalker and stuff like that. But then a big gap until I met my first boyfriend, and he kind of introduced me to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, Cyberpunk. I think those were the two and RuneQuest we started playing. And I always felt like a big barrier because I didn't know the system and I didn't know as much as other people did. And I felt self-conscious about that. Like, I would watch them playing like actual, like the battle game Warhammer or 40k and just be like, I want to play this, but I just feel like I can't get over that, like, shyness or embarrassment of not knowing. And I think that's a big barrier to people. And so I think when your system complements what you're doing and kind of unfolds naturally, like, that is a real bonus for people who are coming new to the world of RPGs.
Totally. And I think for me, the hardest thing is when you're trying. It's as all of these things, like, it all comes back to communication, right? As we've said before, that, like, having a good session zero, having a good sense of what type of game you're wanting to play before you start. because I think for me that if I think of, and there have been blessedly few, I'm borderline incoherent tonight. There have been blessedly few of these instances, but when I've had bad RPG experiences, they tend to be because, like, and as far as I'm aware, we are trying to tell one type of story, and the system is like hardwired to tell a different type of story. And that doesn't mean that you can't succeed, but the system is pushing you one way. And the obvious example, not to throw shade at D&D, but the obvious example is D&D. D&D is a game that is fundamentally designed around killing monsters. And so if you're trying to tell a story that does not revolve around killing monsters, you have to change D&D. You have to adapt it a bit. So,
that was a nice segue into the next question. Zoltan asks, what do you think are the biggest advantages for a GM or designer when working with an open source system rather than creating their own rule set from scratch?
Well, I think, there's always more work recreating the wheel than buying a wheel or modding a wheel, and that's just true of most anything. Rebuilding something from scratch is always going to usually end up being more work. I say usually because, really common example is people trying to hack D&D into like a mystery system or a dramatic system, and it's just that's a lot. That is more work than just making a basic rules light one of your own.
Yeah, but just play another game.
But yeah, usually for the most part, using an SRD, even if it's just for the inspiration and ideas, adds a little boost to the process and gives you a little head start on getting some things figured out that you not necessarily would have just starting from a blank page. A good example is someone I know kind of designed their game literally based on their polite but disagreements with a different SRD. It wasn't like a hostile, like, oh, I hate this game. It's just like, I would have done that differently. And so you don't even necessarily have to use it on a direct basis. But obviously, if you go to, like the Breathless SRD or something like that and build it based on the rules there, and then just kind of framework out to build your little subsystems for your own concept, a lot of work is pre-done for you. And I think that's really the huge advantage. But also, like I said, like you riff off of them. And so sometimes just getting ideas from SRDs and the way they approach rules, you'll see a lot of time in conversations on Blue Sky, on Mastodon, on RPG.net and stuff. People are like, this whole concept was unlocked for me when I read this, when I read this game or read this SRD. So there's just all kinds of ways where it's just not necessarily just straight using the SRD, but they really provide a lot of head starts and advantages and perspectives that you would have otherwise missed.
And sort of moving on from that, Zoltan follows up with, are there any common mistakes GMs or indie designers make when using open licenses like the OGL or Creative Commons?
Sometimes, yes, but for the most part, people are pretty good about them. I would say the most like OGL, it's much more common to have your brand identity and your open content. Like that's a whole big thing for a split. The same thing with the Orc license, which is the big successor for OGL that people are using. With Creative Commons, I think one of the number one mistakes that people make is not realizing they can do the same thing with Creative Commons licenses. With a Creative Commons license, the way they explicitly work is you can say what's covered or not. I mentioned earlier that like Ars Magica and Thirsty Sword Lesbians have text-only Creative Commons licenses. So they publish the books. It's the regular published RPG, and none of the art and layout and stuff is covered by the open license. You can't just copy any of the art, but any of the text is. And you can even make it more fiddly than that. You can say that all of my rules and my appendices are Creative Commons licensed, but my little story Bible part of it is not. That's proprietary. You are allowed to do that in Creative Commons, and it's just as simple as putting a little notice that says, this is covered, this isn't. There's nothing complicated to it. So I just think it's something people miss, and when they don't, sometimes they overcomplicate it a little bit or overthink it, and it's the whole point of the Creative Commons licenses are supposed to be just how easy they are to use.
Shadishan asks, would the Rookery ever consider an open source license for the Coiled Crown? I guess as there's only two of the four of us here, I won't actually answer it, but that is really interesting to hear. That you could take parts of it, which maybe I didn't appreciate how granular you could be, and certainly would make it more attractive to any company, especially one that was equally proud of both the creative story you're telling, but also the rules that you're creating. Then yeah, absolutely, you might want to do that and enable those rules, that aspect of it to be used by other people. So yeah, good question. We'll take a note and come back to you in another chat. So Shadishan asks, how do you balance community input with a clear design vision in an open source game project?
Ooh, okay. So that's honestly a big question. And a lot of it's very personal to the host of the project or the creator that's working on, that made it originally. It's not that different than handling things as a regular publisher or game designer. One huge thing that I'm very big on pointing out to people is there's this thing called expressed preference and revealed preference, and they do not line up well. Which is the concept of it is that people are kind of terrible at telling you what they actually want. People will say they want one thing, and then their behavior and follow-up will show that they wanted something sometimes even completely contrary to that than what they thought they did in their mind. And so it is a very complicated thing balancing feedback. You have to be aware of aspects like that. You have to be aware that everybody has their little bugbears, and so you're going to get feedback that's kind of obsessive about what seems like minor details or minor misunderstandings and things like that. And so there is a lot of tangled mess to work through, and so I understand why that's a really good question. But those are two things that very much I would point out right at the beginning. And that's not to say disregard feedback by any means. People know what they find fun or don't find fun, and things like that. And so that's another part of it is the simpler and more root level the feedback is, like, this is fun, or we really got into the chaos points, like it made things crazy. Those are pretty clear points of feedback, or like, this wasn't fun, like everybody just thought this was super tedious. Those sort of root level, very basic gut level sort of feedback points are usually very reliable. Where it starts getting unreliable is when people start getting more specific with their feedback in the way of, well, that didn't work, but this specific kind of subsystem would be a good answer to it. And again, I'm really not trying to denigrate feedback or tell you to disregard it, but the chances are that that's going to be good feedback are really low. Whether in terms of a fit or whether just objectively good or bad.
Yeah, and it might be really specific feedback for a really specific problem that only came up in that really specific playtest or run through or input that you're getting. but for that person or that group, like, it made a massive difference, but actually fixing it or changing it is not necessarily going to change the experience of the game for the vast majority of people.
And you know that you unintentionally perhaps bring up a really, really good point about how to interpret feedback and you know, put it into use, where when you get feedback and it's really fiddly or it's sort of weird, you know how there's the concept of like collapsing to core in role-playing games, where, you know, if a subsystem isn't working out or you can't remember the rules, you can default to like the core roles.
Yeah.
Well, it's sort of a similar thing where if it's a little fiddly or, you know, it doesn't sound quite right to you, collapse it back to the broader principles. Like, okay, they're saying that this was really kind of fiddly and boring and that this is the way they would do it. Well, how would you generically describe the direction that they're trying to point in? Does it, you know, are they looking for more narrative triggers? Are they looking for something that this has like a little bit more dramatic, cinematic of a feel? Are they looking for something with a little more clarity? And so you can take that feedback that is not necessarily good for you as is and still get useful things out of it by distilling it down to sort of, just like you would do a game, distilling it down to the themes, do the same thing with feedback. And a lot of that feedback that may not have been as useful for you at first could end up reinforcing other feedback or adding good context to it or just being useful in itself.
Yeah, that's a really good tip.
Andy, and we definitely, when we were playtesting Ship of Fools, an adventure that we're working on, it was interesting, like when we were soliciting that feedback from the GM. So this is a system agnostic multi-plot adventure that we got people to play test in lots of different systems. So trying D&D and The Expanse and Warhammer and Blades in the Dark and all these different systems. And I tried to draw, when we were putting together the kind of feedback questionnaires, tried to draw on the kind of questioning I would use in the classroom in terms of getting like being very clear, like what the purpose was of that question. So it is the question there to just elicit a general response, like you know, we enjoyed this part of the story, we enjoyed the way it was moving this way. Or occasionally it was like a very granular question, because it was like we'd put something quite specific in and we're like, right, we need to know if this specific mechanical element or this specific trigger or whatever the more nitpicky thing was that we put in, whether that kind of works or not. And it was I find, I don't know about you, Lindsay, but I find it an incredibly satisfying experience because we put the thought in before. I think if we hadn't, the feedback that we got might have been
for sure
there. But
so I got distracted because I was thinking about the concept of collapsing to core and having an Inception RPG where the most complicated system was like the reality, and every time you went down a level your system like collapsed one level down to become more simple. So you had like 12 stats when you were in reality, and then you went down to, I don't know, like 6, and they were just like 3 physical, 3 mental, and then you went down again, and I got slightly distracted planning my collapse to core Inception system while you were talking, Andy Leask.
That's all right. I like it.
I'll try to be better in future.
No, I like that idea, and I'm always happy to inspire people to start thinking of new game ideas. That's fun. Yeah.
We've come up with loads on these Inside the Rookeries, haven't we? Andy and I are going to have to go back and like revisit
we never write them
down. Like what we thought of when we had a guest on.
Yeah, you go back and be like, oh man, that was a great idea.
Yeah. We need someone to do community notes like we have on Lawhammer. Somebody can give a transcript of whatever we say.
So real quick, one more point on this question. For explicitly working with an open game project, obviously you have your maintainers or your lead developers for most open source projects that can enforce a little bit of vision. But one thing that can help a lot is having like a core document that has your basic principles and like any core canon, like, okay, we're specifically using D6 dice pools for this, or things like that. Like the basic outlines of the project can help keep everybody in bounds and directed, especially if you make sure to have like a little list of like 5 to 7 principles that guide the project. And if you need some ideas, looking at like Wikipedia principles and policies are pretty good inspiration for that type of document.
And Tillers says in the chat, I thought about making my own RPG system for my world, but now I just add stats and new rules for Wifrip 4th edition. And Cypher might add Chaosium's basic role-playing system at some point. Absolutely. Like, just crack on with it. Like, take whatever you need from wherever you want to make
like a
the game that you want to do. Like a magpie, We're all
and Cypher and BRP are especially modular and have a lot of guidance out there about making hacks and how those systems work.
Yeah.
And again, it comes down to when you're cribbing those kind of systems, it's like what do you need, and it's then looking for something to fulfill that need. That, like, the thing I've always sort of suggested, and who knows, maybe it'll turn up in our Crown system that we're working on. But I've always suggested to Andy Law that we need for our Warhammer game, and he has quite rightly, I think, resisted because it's not in Warhammer, and therefore we change the flavor of the game that we're telling. But in Conspiracy X, one of the key things there was that your players, who are part of this little cell that are kind of fighting off the aliens or whatever, are also members of some other organization. So you might be an FBI agent, and someone else might be in the Air Force, and somebody else might be a journalist, and you have like pulling strings connections. You have like the ability to kind of like influence within those, and depending which organization it is, that might mean different things. And I've always felt that careers really needed something like that in them to actually reflect it. So if you're a merchant, you're in the Merchants Guild, well, that should give you some mechanical way to kind of represent the fact that you have influence in the world and you can pull strings. If you are in the army, similarly. But
it's quite like World of Darkness, like allies and contacts. Remember the arguments we used to have about the difference between an ally and a contact? And then we would like assign all the people we knew in real life to whether they were allies or contacts. My brother works for the BBC, and do I have an ally high up in the British broadcasting world? Who knows? Supernaut says, I'm currently designing my own cyberpunk-style RPG with BRP. Great system, is simple to get going with. So back to a question from Stishin. What's the biggest challenge to keeping volunteer momentum in open source game development, and how can it be overcome?
That's a big problem for a lot of open source projects. I'm sure you've noticed that the overwhelming majority of open source projects that get off the ground in the first place, a lot of them didn't, never really get very far. But for even the ones that get off the ground, I'm sure you've noticed most of them collapse within like 1 to 3 years, generally speaking. So a big thing, a lesson to learn from that is to manage burnout. If it's an open source project and you've got 3 to 6 people who are churning out content like they're actually a full-time working team, they got whole lives to live, and it's an open source project. They're going to get burned out. So while at first it's good to encourage that culture of contribution to get it going and get your seed content going, once you get people contributing or participating in the ecosystem, it's really important to emphasize to them to like take time for themselves, essentially, to make sure that they do self-care, and to if you have some big mega contributors and stuff, it would be good to make some guidelines to be like, we only really expect people who are truly dedicated to this project to work on it maybe 10 hours a week, so that when they're putting in 40, it kind of throws a contrast for them without, because you don't want to be a dick. You're not trying to scare off the people who are most invested, but you do want to kind of give them some context so they have polite cues to say, oh wow, I've been going a little overboard for themselves, because it's something everybody has to judge for themselves, but you can structure things so that people don't burn out as much by giving them that, because social cues are a big thing for how we behave. If you work in a big grind culture, workplace, everybody there, even the laziest person compared to most workplaces, is going over the top. You know what I mean? Whereas if you work at a more laid back place, somebody who comes in there with a grind culture mindset is just going to burn themselves out completely in that kind of environment because it's just not suited for them.
Yeah, I've seen it in the world of banking where people come from investment banks to work in retail banks and vice versa, and the culture shock for both of those parties is always quite something to observe if you're in either of those cultures. Yeah, Will Spade said guilds and organizations are so often overlooked in RPGs, and Tiller says BRP Vikings just came out. Andy, you've been obsessively watching YouTube videos on that. On what? Guilds and organizations?
On guilds, yeah, medieval guilds and stuff. I disappeared down the YouTube wormhole.
Oh, did
and
you?
the algorithm is just giving me more because that's what the algorithm wants. So, yeah.
I'm, as you know, I'm a bit obsessed with those tourist boards. We talked about it last week that you find in cities, and they often talk about the local guilds or organizations, I have to say. So yeah, they're a good source of information for you. Right, what is next? So Zoltan asks, do you believe open source RPG systems encourage more creativity, or do they risk leading to too much sameness across indie games?
Am I allowed to say both? I think
you can say whatever you like. It's your interview.
It's paradoxically both. On the sameness, there's some really obvious examples. There's a ton of Forged in the Dark games that are just blades in the dark with the most superficial paint job. You know what I mean? And everybody knows Powered by the Apocalypse games and the super standard model they have, where you roll your 2d6, you have your playbooks and their sets of moves, and you have your behavior triggers. One gives you like a story point or similar fuel, like a psychic fuel or whatever it is for that game, and one gives you XP. And it's a super standard model, despite the fact that PBTA by itself is an incredibly broad and diverse thing. And so that kind of jumps into the other side where it does. You got that. You're gonna have the sameness. That's just humanity. It's how we are. We're little imitation monkeys. That's just life. We are. Even when you're being more creative, you're just nothing new under the sun, and we're building on the exposure and culture that we have. But in terms of encouraging creativity, I think as much as Powered by the Apocalypse is like a canonical textbook example of the sameness, it's also a canonical textbook example of that creativity. There's all kinds of things that came out of that gaming movement, including Blades in the Dark, and even much more abstract and different games like and systems like Belonging Outside of Belonging came out of the Powered by Apocalypse kind of mindset and movement and stuff. And so I think it's just it's both, and it really depends on how you individually handle those materials. But I think you have some really good examples of things that were inspired by a particular type of model that just totally broke the mold and turned into something completely different. And you have examples of where it's the same thing over and over.
So we talked a lot about. Oh, sorry, Andy, you go.
Well, I was just going to say, like I suppose at its core, like what those open source RPG systems do is they give you like freedom, in that they give you freedom to create and freedom to reproduce, and then ultimately it comes down to, if you are making something, how strong a sense do you have of what you're creating, and therefore you're just cherry picking the bits you need, and to what extent are you essentially just reskinning because I like this but I don't like that element, so I'm going to nudge it. But either way, I think it is fundamentally good for the industry because it empowers people to create. And I think, not to lapse into cliches and rising tides and raise boats and all that, but genuinely, I do think it is better for the industry. The more of us that create interesting things, interesting ways to tell interesting stories, the better we all get at doing that.
So we talked a lot about open source systems and creation in kind of abstract, but now we're going to talk a little bit about game jams and actually like doing it right there and then. So Zoltan asks, what advice would you give to someone participating in their first RPG game jam?
Number one thing is don't worry about perfection. Don't over stress about what you're putting out. It's a jam, first of all. Everybody understands it's time constraints and it's for fun and it's no big deal. So the really important number one thing is it doesn't really matter what you put out for the game jam, just put it out. Just get her done, you know. So as they say, I think that's a big thing that holds a lot of people back for game jams. Is they tend to overthink it and try overbuilding what they're working on. And I think that highlights one of the things that game jams are great for is if you do a lot of game jams, you will get very, very good at taking your concepts and making a short, distilled little playtest module out of them that has the core rules and concepts spelled out. And I think that's a good way to kind of look at it is when you're doing a game jam, if you have a bigger concept, just think of it as like, this is the basic playtest, or this is the quick start. And that will help you kind of narrow down and cut out some of that extra cruft that is too much to handle for a game jam.
Yeah, I've sort of been, Andy and I have done it, but I've also mentored for game jams, but I've also done it in like different industries where you're the mentor or like coming in to be presented to, and there's a common pitfall where someone, you know, it's kind of like the feedback you were talking about before. Someone gets kind of obsessed with one part of the game that they've created and goes to quite a lot of effort to convince you why that's really important and a really good part of the thing that they've created. And I guess what I'm hearing you say is let that go, let those specifics go, and try and distill it down to that core so you can get over the essence of what the game is or is going to be in the future.
Yeah, that goes back to that whole collapsing the core thing. I love that concept. It's applicable to so many things.
100%. Yeah, it was definitely, like, I remember last year that there was one, and I don't think the game has made it to in any way commercially. If it has, then I'm delighted to be wrong, and I will buy a copy at next year's Tabletop Scotland. But there was a group, and it was great because one of the nice things about the Tabletop Scotland Game Jam is you can just do it on your own. You can turn up with a group of friends, but also you can get randomly just put together with a bunch of different people. And so the group that I kind of was checking in with, there was, I think there were 5 of them, but they were like a very vast range of ages kind of in that group. They didn't know each other. I think there was a father and a son maybe in it, but the rest of them didn't know each other. But they'd come up with this like Wheel of Death game, you know, the kind of motorbikes that kind of go around. And it was really interesting because I checked in with them 2 or 3 times. I asked Phil, who's obviously one of our feathered friends who's popped on a few times. And like both times we kept giving them the same feedback. And it was, I didn't really crystallize my head until you said it, Rev, but it was that collapse into core because they had this core idea of the play going round, the way the motorbikes were going round, and then you had these different maneuvers, and they kept adding in interesting little features. You're like, well, that's an interesting feature, but it's taking you away from the core of what that game is actually supposed to do. Like, everything you do should be in service of what this game was about. And by the end of the weekend, what they had was like laser focused on the kind of the purpose, the fundamental function of the game, but also had lots of interesting systems within it. But they were all in support of that core goal. So it's you've really helped me today, Rev. Actually, clarify that design principle. I like that. Thank you.
And just a brief interlude for a joke. Can you put jams on toast? Mark says. The toast provides the crunch, presumably. Thank you, Mark. Okay, so I think we've covered this a little, but if there's anything else you want to go into, let's have a think about it. So Zoltan asks, how did time constraints during a game jam impact your design philosophy? Do you focus on innovation, simplicity, or something else?
I think, at least for me, everybody's a little different, but for me, it really pushes me hard back into the like design to concept, very concept first driven. Like, this is what I'm doing. What do I need to make it happen? It helps clarify the boundaries and the stakes and everything, rather than kind of getting lost in the meta thought of like, what kind of system do I want and things like that. Like, mentioning dinosaur wizards in space. What do I need to make them dinosaur wizards and in space? And that's exactly, it's a 2-page game, so it's exactly just that, basically.
Like, what did you need? Do they come from space, or have they gone to space in a rocket that they have made, the dinosaurs?
Okay, so the canon of it is that they are dinosaurs from Earth that escaped the asteroid.
Got it. We can all take inspiration from these dinosaurs.
They escaped from the asteroid, and part of it is that they're trying to find out where the other dinosaurs are.
Oh, I really feel for the dinosaurs. Why are they wizards?
Because they're wizards, and that's fun.
Yeah, because otherwise, how would they have escaped from Earth?
Because
they
dinosaurs
don't have opposable thumbs.
Right, exactly. And besides, dinosaur space wizards are awesome.
Yeah, I'm with you. Sorry, I'm lost now in a fantasy of dinosaur space wizards. I'll bring myself back down to earth. And so what is your favorite project you've ever made? And actually, we can make this multi-part, so you can answer each bit of it. Andy, you can too. You've ever made during a jam or using an open license, and why does it stand out for you? And also, what good ones have you seen other people make, perhaps? So, yeah.
Oh, okay. So, my favorite thing that I made during a jam originally is a game called Never Stop Smiling, which originally was a word-limited 1-page game. It's a little surreal post-apocalyptic universe where there's like a walled city that protects you from a shattered, shifting world, and nobody really dies there. Everybody, if you die, you just reappear. And they have a gospel of happiness. Everybody has to keep smiling, and that's what they believe keeps them immortal. And it's sort of like a little dystopian utopia kind of thing, and post-apocalyptic, kind of fun. But it started off just as a 1-page game, and now it has a second edition as a full game. It's over 100 pages long. So that's probably why that's my favorite, just because it started off as just the littlest baby, and it turned into this whole huge game on its own.
And do you like to explore like real world like questions or concepts that you're thinking about yourself in games that you make, or do you view games as much more like just escapism from reality? We talked about this a little bit last week, so I decided to ask.
Kind of both. As I mentioned earlier, I have a game called Dick Punch Every Suit, so that's pretty straightforward in terms of its sentiment and connections to feelings about the real world and stuff like that. And obviously not everything is as blunt as that, but whether intentionally or not, there's deeper themes in everything. I mean, even a silly little game like, we talked about dinosaur wizards in space, like, there are people whose home was destroyed. Most of their relatives were wiped out, and they're lost in space and trying to find their people. And there's all kinds of obvious parallels and themes inherent in that, and that's just like the silliest little game. So I think it always comes up, and it's always at least in the back of your mind. And obviously a game like Never Stop Smiling, where it's the law that you have to smile. There's questions about conformity and, what is actually being happy. And, there's that, everybody has that experience of they put on their public face versus how they actually feel as a person. And so I think everything has those kinds of themes to it, and I think it's always in the back of my mind on some level, even when I'm making just the little silly games.
I think that's what triggered me to ask, because you sort of, it was like a small thing that, you know, but actually it sounded really profound. And when you described it to begin with, it was like, oh, ha ha ha, that sounds fun. Oh, wait, no, that has like profound implications for that society. And what does that mean? Yeah. Okay, so in your view, Zoltan asks, what is one underrated open source system or license that GMs and designers should be paying more attention to right now?
Honestly, I'm gonna do a shout out for a relative big boy. Just because there are a lot of SRDs out there and people are aware that they're SRDs, they use them. You know, belonging outside of belonging, the breathless SRD. But people know of them as SRDs. So I'm going to shout out Ars Magica, actually, because they are Creative Commons attribution share like opened. So it's even like a viral full open source license, just like the GPL and things that you use for open source software, where anybody who uses it also has to license it under the text under the same license. So you always add to the open source pool, and I think that's kind of cool. And I think it's very cool that something as large and influential and known as Ars Magica has that kind of license. And I don't think a lot of people are aware of it. And I think it would be cool to see more people play with it.
I was about to say, I hope that Andy Lee's Google Foo is, but he's done it. I can rely on him. I don't even need to ask. It's just there. The link's just there, ready for me to pick up.
And genuinely, I did not know that it was under a Creative Commons license like that. So
no,
yeah,
right,
exactly. Everybody knows the game, but it was only recently that I found out myself. I think, like in the past month or two, we were joking. I mistyped Ars Magica as Ars Magical. And I was like, oh, somebody should make a Magical Girls Ars Magica, ha ha ha. And then just out of curiosity, I looked up, I was like, oh, Ars Magica license in Google. And then it came up, I was like, oh wow, you're actually open license. That's awesome.
Yeah, I had no idea. Do you know, I've never actually played Ars Magica. I've got like a random set of games that like you'd think I would have played, but I've never actually played. Maybe I'll need to remedy that.
That's a large part of that, I think, Lindsay, is because obviously you and I largely have played in the same group, largely with your husband as our forever GM. So
it's true. And once we get into a campaign, those campaigns have been long. And
they were like 14 years. So.
Yeah. Right, here's potentially a controversial one from John Pitt. So, do you think the OGL controversy? Do you know what's more controversial is how I'm pronouncing controversy. Is it controversy or controversy? Not sure. Do you think? Yeah, thank you. Do you think the OGL controversy actually ended up bringing the community closer together, or has it left unresolved trust issues?
Oh yeah, there's totally all kinds of unresolved trust issues across the board. There's still some splits and sour feelings for people towards certain parts of the DNC influencer and video people based on sort of how they've defended Wizards of the Coast and stuff during the whole thing. And for Wizards itself, there's still very much bad blood there. They misled people into believing that the OGL as written was irrevocable. And when they got blunt and greedy enough that it was not, that obviously really terrified a lot of people and hurt a lot of feelings and put a lot of small businesses at risk and things. They engaged in so much other nefarious and seedy behavior and stuff that I feel like it's the OGL thing was like just a big nail going in the coffin. It was just such a huge controversy and thing, but it took place in the context of a whole bunch of other stuff, and there's been a whole bunch of other stuff happening since then. And so, yeah, I feel like there's a lot of unresolved trust issues, and there's unfortunately still some conflict in the community too when it comes down to feelings about D&D and wizards and things like that.
Yeah, and just generally about corporations, full stop, and how much companies actually understand and love the product that they're making versus just making something for money. I was going to bring up, because it felt appropriate, the link that Andy had done earlier for like punch suits in the dick or whatever, because that seems kind of appropriate here. But also that whole thing, like Mark's comment about it just sums up the whole thing for me, which is just, it's really complicated and confusing and not easy for small businesses to understand. So Mark's comment, Wizards of the Coast just put out a 5.2 SRD that tried to claw back the deck of many things, renamed in SRD 5.2 only to avoid using protected trademarks, still referred to as deck of many things in official products, despite it being released CC in the SRD 5.1. Doesn't seem very trustworthy. And goes to them apparently not actually reading what a CC by license was and how it works. And it just sums it up for me, like, who has time to like parse all that?
Right. Yeah. Most, the average person isn't going to understand, first of all, isn't going to understand that, like, they can't do that. Once it's under a CC license, it's forever under that license, even if you decide to stop adding the license to it. And I think the other point is whether or not that's the technically correct thing and legally correct thing. Hasbro is an effing $1 billion company. They can drive you into the ground with pocket change. And so that, like, you mentioned, well, how trustworthy is that? Like, how much can I rely on the fact that this is supposed to be Creative Commons licensed and have faith that you're not going to change your mind and send your lawyers after me?
Exactly.
Again, for what's just pocket change or free time for the lawyers they already have on staff. Like, oh, you guys have 5 hours of free time this week? Great. Go send some nasty grams to these people.
Yeah, to small businesses or, not-for-profit businesses who, like, literally, it's not even pocket change. Like, it's so less than pocket change, the amount of money that a small business might make from their use of that license. And it outrages me. Anyway.
Oh, no, I was thinking the pocket change part is that it's just pocket change for wizards to...
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
They can pay tens of thousands of dollars, like a sneeze, for lawyers. And just, trying to get a lawyer as a small business creator can break your back.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, you need to, as a small business, usually you need to rely on like local government funding, grants. You need to rely on the stuff that's out there that your government has provided to help you get off the ground, and you shouldn't be using it to like defend yourself against massive corporations. That's not what it's been put in place for. I'm so angry about this. I've gone blurry. I'm gonna need to, the camera has refused to focus on me.
And also like as we've spoken about before in our streams, like you can't copyright mechanics as well.
Yeah.
Like you can copyright words and art and things, but like you can't fundamentally copyright mechanics. So there's also some as soon as people start being disingenuous about what can be protected, when the people with all the money and all the power tell you can't do a thing, even though you can, but they tell you that you can't, it becomes harder to fight back. But also, I don't know, in my slightly curmudgeonly advancing years, more fun to fight back. But maybe that's just
we've got about 30 seconds left, so let's move on from that anger-inducing, controversial topic and go to Zoltan's final question, which is, do you think the future of indie RPGs lies in a more open-source collaboration, or will we see a swing back toward more tightly controlled proprietary systems?
I think at this point, there's still proprietary systems. There's, some of the big second tier titles are still very much proprietary and not released under any kind of actual license. And I don't think that will change necessarily. I think there's always going to be some games, especially when it comes to licensed games, where they even the mechanics aren't open licensed. And I think that makes sense, especially for the companies that do do at least a couple of licensed games, because the companies that are giving you the licenses are very, very controlling and fiddly about what you give away, and they don't want any implication that you're giving away anything connected to their stuff. And that makes sense to me, and there's no shade for that.
No, they've got to protect their IP. Yeah.
But at the same time, I think we've long crossed the Rubicon of whether or not open source collaboration and systems are going to be part of the market. They're such a huge part of the market. And they've been a key part of why tabletop games have expanded and grown the way that they have. We would not be here now if it weren't for Fate and Powered by the Apocalypse having the open approach that they did to adaptations. The Fate and then Powered by Apocalypse were such huge trends, and added so much to the market, brought so many new designers in, new players. I just feel like it's just very much ingrained at this point that we're on to second and third generation open license things. Like you have, like I mentioned, Blades in the Dark, Forged in the Dark, which is based off of Powered by the Apocalypse. And so we're already getting to now the second and third generation of big trends in games that are part of that open licensed ecosystem. And I just feel it's here to stay. It's just such a big part of things now. I can't see it changing.
Yeah. And I definitely, I've noticed a trend recently of GMs just being more confident to essentially be like, you know what, this is the core system that I like, whatever that may be, and that is going to be the core of everything I do, and I'll adapt it and change it, and I'll cut and drop whatever. But I've noticed much more people being much more, I don't want to say like not belligerent, but just like sure in themselves in terms of, you know what, I played all of these systems and this is what I like, and someone else going, good for you, I've played all these systems and this is why. In a way that I don't, and maybe I was just ignorant and wasn't talking to the right people, but I don't remember it being like that 10 years ago. But I feel like it is like that way now. Yeah. Like people are feasting on this TTRPG smorgasbord, and yeah.
Oh yeah. The attitudes definitely have shifted to everybody being much more happy. The 2 pies attitude. Oh my God! Now I have 2 pies.
Yeah, exactly.
People have become a bit more nuanced and open to different preferences and stuff. As an example of that, on my blog, I've shared both a defensive rules light games and a defensive rules heavy games. Crunchy games are not usually my preference, but I can see the appeal of them. Like, for example, the intrinsic joy of system mastery is a huge thing. If you like being able to put parts together and building the little Lego sets with the rules and characters, that's a huge appeal for heavy games and stuff. So
yeah,
and I feel like that attitude is much more is becoming more prevalent. People are much more interactive and encouraging of each other than they feel they used to be. I do agree with you on that.
Well, thank you so much. That brings us to the end of our stream. I've popped in Rev Casey's links there to Drive Through RPG, so please do check those out. Thank you, Rev Casey, for joining us for our 150th episode. It was really great to meet you and have you on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was fun.
Excellent. And thank you to Andy, my fellow Rook, who joined me tonight. And as always, thanks to everyone in the chat for making the stream really good fun. And thank you to our patrons and lovely Discord servers, but community, but specifically to our patrons for keeping the streams beautifully ad-free. Until the next time, all that remains for me to say is good night and caw-caw, caw-caw. See you soon.